Good afternoon. My name is Harold Mendelson. I am a student at Liberty University, and this presentation has to deal with the class HIST 702D02. The purpose of this class, the topic, is going to be Japan and how it had started out in 1850 as a feudal nation that was controlled by a shogun, and how in a period of less than 50 years it had turned itself into an industrial powerhouse. It was the most industrialized nation in Asia and had built one of the most modern navies in the world. What had happened was, 2 years later, in 1852, a U.S. Commodore Perry, under the orders of the President of the United States, had made its way to Asia to open up trade with Asian nations, particularly with the nation of Japan. Now, Japan at the time was a closed nation. It only had one city in which foreign trade was allowed. And this was the result of hundreds of years in the presence of Dutch and Portuguese missionaries who had come initially to spread the word of Christianity, and on top of that to build up relationships with other nations in Europe, so that both Japan and these other nations could develop a better economy. As such, what happened after that was Commodore Perry came in and sailed up Edo Bay, right up to where the seat of government was. And he basically parked his boats and ships in the bay, came ashore, and demanded an audition or an audience with the shogun. This was not possible because the shogun was in bed. He was sick and ill and was unable to receive visitors. So Commodore Perry settled for the number 2 guy, and he handed him a list of documents which basically said, we are the power here that's going to set this up. We want to establish trade with Japan. We're going to open up some cities for us. We'll determine to work that out, and basically that's the way it's going to be. I'll be back in a year. You can have all the details worked out, and then we'll sign the documents, and then we will be doing trade. Now, in most places, this would be an affront. Somebody who wasn't invited bangs on your door, or comes in and demands that you feed him dinner and show him a good time. Well, it was an affront to the Japanese too. Now, the actual emperor of Japan, whose history goes back possibly as far as 2,600 years, but can be confirmed to be at least almost 2,000 years. As such, he was not happy when he saw this. He also looked over at China and realized that the Europeans had carved China up into little chunks. And they called these chunks spheres of influence. And what had happened was they basically ran those little areas, and they made a lot of money by selling drugs and getting cheap imports from China, and between the drugs and then doing the international trade, they had made a lot of money, but the people of China weren't getting any wealthier. All of the money was going to Europe, and none of it was going to China. All they had to show for it was a lot of people that were addicted to drugs. Again, this does not sit well with the Emperor of Japan. You might even say that he didn't like Europeans. Well, in 1895, the Tsar of Russia decided that it was important to have an imperialistic inroads into China. And specifically, they were looking at the port of Port Arthur. This was an all-weather port. It was far enough south to be avoiding from being closed down in the wintertime, and building the Trans-Siberian Railroad, a spur was sent from that railroad inside of Russia and to go south to Port Arthur. This would allow easy transport of goods and services, as well as men and basically supplies. So this served both the military purpose, and it also served a economic purpose. It was during this time that Japan's relationship with Russia became more fragile. This deteriorated even further. In 1904, war was declared between Russia and Japan, and initiated with the start of some land engagements involving the Japanese troops and the Russian troops. It was back and forth, some victories on both sides. Nothing was fully determined. It had no major impact. As such, the next thing was the Navy. Japan had built up a tremendous Navy. It was all modern ships. They took existing designs that they had received from Great Britain and improved upon them, and then improved upon them again. So its ships were modern, they were well armed, well equipped, well trained crews, well led men. They had believed in the tactic of a large single battle to determine the outcome. As such, they had been dealing in short battles with the Russian Pacific Fleet without really reaching any determinate goal. Neither side was victorious because the engagements were too small. What had happened was the Tsar felt that he needed to send his Atlantic Fleet over to the Pacific and engage the Japanese Navy, and that was done. And the Japanese Navy was prepared for this. In fact, you might say they set a trap. The Shimano Straits, which is between Korea and Japan, was the setting. They had laid a trap for the Russian Navy, and the Russian Navy walked right into it. The Japanese, who had practiced their gunnery and practiced their seamanship and tactics, were superior to that of the Russian Navy, who had relied strictly on their reputation and the size of their navy to get their point across. They were truly paper tigers. Their navy was getting older, The equipment wasn't running as it should, and they didn't have the leadership that they needed to have an effective Navy. A lot of these people were in charge because they were counts and royalty, and not because they were good commanders of men. As such, the Russians were defeated decisively. Immediately afterwards, they sued for peace, and with the mediator of Teddy Roosevelt, the war was declared over, peace treaties were signed, and Russia had lost all of the colonies and the railroad spur that it had created, as well as Korea itself. Japan had taken over Korea and that part of China. We let it now go forward. World War I took place. At the end of the war, German colonies were now turned over to Japan. So they had increased their sphere of influence in the Pacific. They had a number of colonies throughout. We all know what happened after that. They declared war on China, the rape of Nanking, the attack on Pearl Harbor, the various battles throughout the Pacific War, and eventually the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That combined with Russia, the Soviet Union at this point, had declared war on Japan, and in a matter of 2 weeks had basically conquered all of the lands that the Japanese military had spent years accumulating. This marked the end of Japan's attempts at becoming a world power and a controller of all of Asia. Now, why did this happen? It all kind of goes back to what was happening in China and to the brashness of Commodore Perry, who came in with the attitude, I'm in charge and you're going to listen to me. That's not the Japanese way. Well, that's what happened. The realization that they either had to improve or get swallowed. They had to be the biggest fish in the pond and the toughest. And that's what they did. They became. Unfortunately, the military corruption, not in money, but in power, overtook what they wanted to do and eventually led them down to the path of destruction. That's all I have to say tonight. I want to thank you very much. I appreciate you for listening and looking forward to your feedback. Thank you again.